It's strange how silence can become louder than any scream. 15 years ago, my son and his friends thought it would be funny to leave me stranded in another state with nothing but the clothes on my back and a half-empty purse. Let's see if she can make it back. They laughed as their car disappeared down the dusty road. I remember standing there on the side of that highway, the sky turning gold behind me, and my hands shaking, not from fear, but disbelief. A mother gives life, and sometimes her own child returns the favor with cruelty. I didn't call for help. I didn't chase the car. I simply walked until I found a new place, a new name, and a new life. And today, 15 years later, my phone shows 107 missed calls, all from him. I'm Margaret Turner, 74 years old. The day they left me behind, I was 59, a widow for more than 20 years, once a community nurse in Kansas. I raised my son Jason alone since he was 10. I used to believe that if I loved enough, if I sacrificed enough, my child would never hurt me. But life doesn't work that way. I still remember the sound of their laughter fading into the distance. It mixed with the hum of tires and the dry wind that scraped across the empty highway. I was 59 then, old enough to know better than to expect kindness from those who mocked the weak. Yet I never thought that cruelty would come from my own son. The sun was sinking low over the desert horizon when I realized the truth. They weren't coming back, not after that cruel joke they planned at the rest stop. My son Jason had handed me a cup of lukewarm coffee and said, "Mom will be right back. Don't move, okay?" I smiled, believing him like I always did. 5 minutes later, the roar of their truck disappeared behind the dunes, and I was alone. There are moments in life when silence feels like a weapon. That afternoon, it cut through me, sharper than any blade. The road stretched endlessly on both sides, shimmering in the heat. I stood there clutching my old leather purse, staring at the last trace of dust where the truck had vanished. A single word kept echoing in my head. Why? At first, I told myself it was a prank, that maybe he'd come back laughing, saying, "Got you, Mom." But as the sun began to sink, the joke turned into something darker, something final. I started walking. The air was dry enough to sting my throat, and my shoes were too thin for the gravel. Every mile I walked felt like I was shedding an old layer of who I used to be, the mother who always forgave, who always said yes, who never questioned why love had to hurt this way. By dusk, I found a small diner by the road. The sign buzzed weakly, Eddie's Grill open, 24 hours. Inside, the air smelled of fried onions and burnt coffee. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, looked at me for a moment before asking softly, "Rough day, honey?" I nodded. She poured me a cup of water and left it without another word. That small act, so ordinary, so human, broke something inside me. I hadn't realized how thirsty I was until that moment. I spent the night in the booth pretending to read an old newspaper left behind by a trucker. The hum of the refrigerator was my lullaby. Outside, trucks passed like ghosts, moving alive, free. When morning came, I decided not to call anyone. Not Jason, not my sister in Michigan, not even the neighbor who once offered me her spare room. I wanted to see what would happen if I simply stopped being available. For years, I had been the one answering calls, cooking meals, bailing out debts, and forgiving insults. I had raised Jason alone after his father left when he was 10. Every paycheck I earned cleaning motel rooms went to his future, his school, his dreams, his comfort. I thought I'd given him enough love to protect him from bitterness. I was wrong. By the third day, I'd hitched a ride with a kind truck driver named Harold. He said nothing for the first hour, just handed me a bottle of water and turned on the radio. When he finally spoke, it was quiet, respectful. Running away or starting over, he asked. I looked out the window at the endless highway. "Does it matter?" I said. He nodded. "Guess not. Sometimes both lead to the same place." That line stayed with me for years. When we reached a small town in Colorado, I got off and thanked him. He gave me $40 and said, "Buy yourself a warm meal, and don't tell me where you're going, that way you can really start over." That night, under the pale motel light, I looked at myself in the cracked mirror. My face was sunburnt, my eyes swollen from exhaustion, but something in me had shifted. The part of me that begged for my son's attention had gone quiet. I found a job at a local bakery. The owner, Mrs. Clark, hired me without asking too many questions. If you can show up before sunrise and knead dough without complaining, she said, you're already better than half my staff. For the next 15 years, I lived quietly. My name changed on paper, my hair turned silver, and my laughter, once broken, became soft again. I learned that peace isn't the absence of noise. It's the decision to stop waiting for an apology that will never come. Sometimes, though, when the bread rose in the oven and the scent filled the air, I'd think of Jason. I'd wonder if he ever remembered that highway, that moment when he decided I was disposable. Then one winter evening, as the snow fell outside the bakery window, my phone buzzed for the first time in years. Unknown number. I let it ring. Then another call. And another. By midnight, there were 57 missed calls. By dawn, 107. When I finally opened the message, it was a single line, "Mom, please. I found you." I stared at the screen for a long time, my hands trembling, the sound of the oven timer beeping behind me. For 15 years, I had been silent. Now, I had to decide if silence was still my answer. I never thought I would see Jason again, not because I hated him, but because I had buried every memory of him in the deepest corner of my heart, where pain no longer cries, it only settles into silence. That morning, snow fell thick over the bakery roof like powdered sugar. I was arranging trays of warm bread. The smell of butter and cinnamon filled the air. The door swung open and a blast of cold wind rushed in. A man stood there, thin pale, his hair dusted with gray, his eyes both familiar and foreign. I didn't need a closer look. A mother always recognizes her child even when her heart once broke because of him. "Excuse me, are you Margaret Turner?" he asked, voice trembling like someone who had lost more than he could admit. I kept my tone calm, almost polite. "No, there's no one here by that name. I'm Maggie Clark now." Jason froze. His eyes searched my face. His lips parted, then tightened. "It's you," he whispered. "Mom." "I'm sorry." I set the tray down, removed my gloves, and brushed flour from my sleeve. "Mom," I repeated softly. "I had a son once, yes, but he died, at least inside my heart, 15 years ago." The bakery went completely silent. Only the clock ticked, and I could hear his shaky breathing fill the space between us. He began to speak words falling apart that day. It was my fault. I was drunk. They dared me. I thought it was just a joke. But when I came back, you were gone. I called. I looked everywhere. You never answered. I looked straight into his eyes. I didn't answer because I chose not to. He lowered his head, hands clenched. In those eyes, I saw not the boy I raised, but a man hollowed out by regret. I invited him to sit not out of forgiveness, but out of the courtesy one gives a ghost from the past. I poured 2 cups of black tea. "How have you been?" I asked quietly. Jason glanced around, his voice barely above a whisper. "I got divorced. My business went bankrupt. I went back to Kansas. The old house you sold is falling apart. People said you were dead. Then I saw a post about this bakery. I knew it was you." I sipped my tea, the bitterness spreading slowly across my tongue. "I once taught you," I said, "that if someone truly wants to find you, they'll walk every mile until they do. Now you found me. So what will you do next?" He didn't answer. Tears rolled down his face, tracing lines of shame. "Mom, I don't deserve forgiveness. But please, let me at least see you. Let me make it right." I looked at the man who once was my entire world. For a second, I saw the 10-year-old boy chasing me through wheat fields, laughing under the sun, and then he vanished, leaving only the man who sat before me broken. Forgiveness, I said slowly, is not something you can demand. It's a gift only the deeply wounded are capable of giving. Jason wept harder, shoulders shaking. Customers in the bakery turned to look. I placed my hand on the table, steady and firm. You taught me something too, Jason. Some losses aren't meant to be repaired, they exist, so we learn how to live without expecting anyone to fix them. He nodded through tears. I understand. I didn't know you were alive. All these years, I only wanted to hear your voice once more. I reached into the drawer and took out a yellowed envelope. Inside was a faded photograph of us standing in front of the old house and a note written in my handwriting, "When you finally know what loneliness truly feels like, read what I once taught you." I placed it before him. Now you know, don't you? He nodded, his voice breaking. Yes. Mom. I turned away and returned to the counter. I heard the door open, cold wind rushing in again, and then close, softly. The room was once more filled with butterflower and silence, the kind of peace I had spent my whole life searching for. That evening, while cleaning the tables, I found a small note left behind. The handwriting was shaky but clear. I won't bother you again, but I'll live the way you taught me. I promise. I folded the paper and placed it in my drawer beside old recipes and my late husband's bracelet. Not because I had forgiven, but because I wanted to remember that sometimes repentance itself is a form of love even if it arrives too late. The bakery felt emptier after Jason left. His shadow lingered long after the door closed, like the scent of cinnamon that never truly leaves the air. That night I sat by the window of my small apartment above the bakery. The snow had stopped and the world outside looked clean, untouched. I held his note in my hand, the one that said he wouldn't bother me again. I wanted to believe him, but my heart, old as it was, knew that remorse rarely ends with a promise. I slipped the note into a drawer beside my husband's silver bracelet and went to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. I dreamt of Jason as a boy, his laughter echoing through the wheat fields behind our house in Kansas, that soft golden time before grief and pride took him away from me. The next morning, when I opened the bakery, a plain white envelope was lying on the floor just inside the door. There was no name, no address, only a faint smudge where snow had melted into the paper. I hesitated, then picked it up. The handwriting on the back was unfamiliar. Inside, there was a single sheet folded twice. Mrs. Clark, you don't know me, but I knew your son. He wasn't alone that day. My chest tightened. The words were written in uneven strokes, hurried but deliberate. He didn't mean for it to happen the way it did. We were kids, stupid and cruel. But there's something you should know. He tried to come back for you that night. He got into an accident on the way, broke his leg. I'm the one who stopped him from calling again. I told him you'd moved on, that it was better for both of you. I was wrong. The letter wasn't signed only a first name Ben. I folded the paper, carefully sat down at the counter, and stared at the snow outside. I hadn't cried in years, but that morning my eyes burned with the kind of pain that comes not from anger, but from understanding too late. He had tried. He had come back. And someone I didn't even know, had decided my story for me. I closed the bakery early that day. The regulars looked surprised, but I simply told them, the oven needs rest. No one argued. Upstairs, I reread the letter again and again until the paper grew soft at the folds. There was no address for this Ben. No way to find him, no way to ask why. Yet his words filled the silence of 15 years like a ghost finally finding its voice. I thought about Jason, not the man who sat crying in my bakery, but the boy who had once built a birdhouse for me from old wood scraps, who had kissed my cheek before school, who had promised to buy Mom a big house one day. Perhaps there was a time when forgiveness could have saved us both, but forgiveness, like bread, needs time to rise. If left too long, it hardens. That night, I walked outside wrapped in my wool coat, the streets glowing faintly under the lamplight. The air smelled like snow and memory. I stopped in front of the bakery's sign, the one that still read, Clark's Bake Shop. My new name, my new life. Yet under it, I still saw the faint outline of the woman I used to be, Margaret Turner. For 15 years, I had been baking bread for strangers, feeding them warmth I once reserved for a son who didn't stay. Maybe that was my way of forgiving the world one loaf at a time. When I came back inside, there was a voicemail blinking on my phone. My heart tightened as I pressed play. Jason's voice filled the room, soft, almost careful. "Mom, I know you said not to come back, but there's something you should know. Ben's dying. He wanted to talk to you before he goes. Please, I'll bring him tomorrow if you'll let me." I stood there frozen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. Outside, snow began to fall again. I didn't know what I would say to the man who had taken 15 years of silence and turned it into guilt. But deep inside, something shifted. Maybe it was time to stop surviving and start understanding. I whispered into the quiet room, "All right, Jason, tomorrow." For the first time in years, I lit a candle by the window the same way I used to when waiting for my son to come home from school. Its small flame trembled in the dark, but it stayed lit. The next morning arrived wrapped in gray light. Snow still clung to the windows like frost-painted lace. I opened the bakery early, though my hands trembled as I set the trays. I had barely slept. Every sound outside, a passing car, a door shutting, made my heart stutter. By noon, the bell over the door chimed. Jason stood there again, his coat wet from melting snow. Beside him was a man in a wheelchair, frail, pale, his face drawn tight around the bones. I didn't need an introduction. Somehow, I knew. "Mrs. Clark," the man said, his voice brittle but sincere. "I'm Ben." For a moment, the room blurred. All those years, his name had lived like a scar in my mind, the stranger who had stolen 15 years of my life with a few careless words. Jason hesitated by the door, eyes down. "He wanted to see you before it's too late." I nodded, motioning toward the small table by the window. The air between us was sharp, brittle, like glass about to crack. Ben looked around, taking in the smell of baked bread, the gentle hum of the oven. "I've dreamed of this place," he said quietly. "Jason told me about it, said it smelled like forgiveness." I didn't answer. I poured tea for all three of us. My hands steady, though my pulse wasn't. He took a breath. "I owe you a truth I've carried for 15 years. I met his gaze and said nothing. That day, Ben began, "We were drinking. Jason didn't want to do it. We all laughed, said it'd be funny. But when we drove off, he changed his mind. He wanted to turn back. I told him it was too late, that you'd be fine, that it was just a joke." He shouted at me, grabbed the wheel, and the truck went off the road. Jason's voice cracked beside him. "Mom, it was my fault." But Ben lifted his trembling hand. "No." The crash broke his leg. "It was me who told him not to call you again. I said you'd moved on, that you didn't want him anymore. I lied because I thought I was helping him forget the guilt." The words fell heavy in the warm air. The clock on the wall ticked once, twice. I stared at the steam rising from the tea, the only thing moving in that frozen silence. "Why tell me now?" I finally asked. Ben's lips quivered. "Because I can't leave this world carrying your pain with me. I ruined a family to protect a foolish friend. I thought time would wash it away, but it doesn't. It rots." Jason bowed his head. "He found me last month in the hospital. Said he wanted to confess. I didn't believe him until I saw the accident report. The date, the road, everything." I looked at both men, one dying, one broken, and felt the old anger rise, but it didn't burn like it once did. It just ached. "You know what hurts the most," I said softly. "It's not what you did. It's what you decided for me. You decided my silence, my grief, my story." Ben's eyes filled with tears. "I know, and I would undo it if I could." I leaned back in my chair, hands folded. "You can't undo 15 years. But you can tell me one thing, did he ever stop trying to find me?" Jason lifted his head, eyes glistening. "Never. Every birthday, every Christmas, I drove that same road. But after a while, it felt like I was chasing a ghost. The confession hung between us like snowfall, quiet, relentless." Ben reached into his coat and pulled out a small photo, faded, wrinkled. It was of Jason and me taken decades ago in front of our Kansas house. He slid it across the table. "I kept this," he said to remind myself of what I broke. I took the photo. My thumb brushed across the edge of it, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel bitterness, just exhaustion. "You came here looking for forgiveness," I said. "But forgiveness isn't a doorway you knock on. It's a garden you plant, and sometimes it takes a lifetime to grow." Ben's breathing grew shallow. Jason reached for his shoulder. "Mom," Jason whispered, "please, say something to him." I looked at Ben, his face, gray eyes, pleading. "I can't give you absolution," I said quietly, "but I can give you peace. You've said your truth. That's enough." He nodded slowly, tears sliding down the deep lines of his face. "Thank you. That's more than I deserve." For a long moment, none of us spoke. Outside, the snow fell harder, softening every sound. I stood, walked to the counter, and wrapped 2 loaves of bread in paper. "Take these," I said to Jason. "One for him, one for you. Bread has a way of reminding people that warmth still exists, even after cold years." Jason nodded, unable to speak. He wheeled Ben toward the door. As they left, the bell above it rang soft, hollow final. When they disappeared into the snow, I looked around the empty bakery. The air still smelled of cinnamon tea and something else, maybe release. That night, I didn't light a candle. I didn't need to. For the first time in 15 years, the darkness no longer frightened me. 3 days passed before I saw his name again. It was printed in the local newspaper, small tucked near the bottom of the obituary column. Benjamin Carter, 63, survived by no family. That was all it said. No story, no photo, just a name on paper. I sat at the counter of the bakery, the same spot where he had sat only days ago, and traced the letters with my finger. The ink bled slightly where my hand trembled. Death has a way of erasing people twice, first from the world and then from memory. But this time, I wouldn't let it happen. I closed the shop early again. The regulars didn't ask why anymore. They'd learned that some silences carry their own explanations. Upstairs in my apartment, I placed the newspaper beside the photo Ben had given me, the one of Jason and me, in front of the Kansas house. For years, that picture had represented betrayal. But now I saw something else in it, a beginning that had never been allowed to end properly. I brewed myself a cup of tea and sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker over the melting snow. The city was quiet but not lonely. It reminded me of who I had become, a woman who had learned to rebuild warmth from the ruins of loss. When I was younger, I used to believe that justice came from truth. Now I understood that sometimes justice comes from understanding. Ben's truth hadn't fixed the past, but it had untied something inside me. It reminded me that cruelty is often just cowardice, and forgiveness, when it finally arrives, doesn't absolve the guilty. It frees the wounded. That night, I wrote a letter. Not to Ben, he was beyond reach now, but to myself. To the woman who was left on the side of the road, you survived. You learned that silence can protect, but it can also imprison. You learned that strength isn't about not breaking, it's about finding beauty in the cracks. And you learned that love, even when it hurts, never disappears. It just changes shape. I folded the letter and slipped it inside the same envelope that once held his confession. 2 stories bound by paper and pain, now resting side by side. The next morning, Jason came to the bakery again. He looked better tired, but lighter. There was a calmness in his voice when he said, "Mom, I read about Ben." I nodded. So did I. He hesitated, then asked, "Did you forgive him?" I wiped the counter slowly, thinking before I answered. Forgiveness isn't a door you walk through once. It's a hallway you walk it a little every day. He nodded quietly. Then, "Maybe I can start walking it too." I smiled, a small, genuine smile that felt new on my face. "Good. But start with yourself, Jason. The rest will follow." He reached across the counter, hesitated, then gently placed his hand over mine. "Thank you, Mom." Those words, simple as they were, carried more weight than any apology could. After he left, I went outside. The sky was pale blue, the kind that only comes after heavy snow. I walked to the park across the street carrying a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. A group of sparrows gathered near the bench. I tore the bread into pieces and scattered them across the snow. They pecked at the crumbs, fearless free. For a moment, I thought of Ben's trembling hands, of Jason's broken voice, of the long road that had brought me here. There was no bitterness left, only peace, quiet, unassuming, steady. As the birds flew off, I whispered, "Rest easy, Ben. You told the truth. That's enough." Then I walked back to the bakery, the wind cold on my face, but gentle, almost like an embrace. That night, I placed the photo, the newspaper clipping, and my letter together in a small wooden box. When I closed the lid, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like breathing again. Spring came slowly that year. The snow melted into thin silver threads running down the gutters, and the air smelled faintly of wet soil and sunlight. I hadn't realized how long I had lived inside winter, not just the season, but the kind that settles inside the heart and forgets how to thaw. One morning, while sweeping the sidewalk in front of the bakery, I noticed the patch of ground beside the shop, a small forgotten corner, where nothing had grown for years. The soil was hard, littered with gravel and last year's dead leaves, but beneath it, something green had begun to push through. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. So the next day, I went to the hardware store, bought a few packets of seeds, a pair of gloves, and a small wooden sign. On the way home, the cashier's words echoed in my head. "Flowers find a way, ma'am. They always do." I started digging that afternoon. The earth resisted at first, cold compacted, but the more I worked, the softer it became. By sunset, my back ached and my hands were sore, but the patch of ground looked alive again. I planted lavender, rosemary, and marigolds. The scent of soil mixed with the faint sweetness of flower drifting from the bakery window above me. It wasn't just a garden. It was a promise that grief could bloom into something gentle, that forgiveness once sown would one day root itself quietly in the earth and stay. As the weeks passed, customers began to notice. A few asked about it. "It's for someone I used to know," I'd say simply, and they'd nod because everyone has someone they used to know. Jason visited more often. Sometimes he'd come early, help water the plants before the bakery opened. Other mornings, he'd just stand there silent, watching the sunlight slide across the petals. One day he asked, "Do you think he'd like it?" I looked at the garden, the colors softly glowing in the morning light. "Yes," I said. "He'd like the quiet." He nodded. "You always find beauty in the smallest places, Mom." "Maybe that's how we survive," I said, "by finding small things to love when the big things break." The garden became our ritual, a way to speak without words, to remember without reopening wounds. Birds began to nest nearby. Neighbors stopped to breathe in the scent of lavender before walking on. One evening, Jason brought a small wooden plaque. It had a simple engraving, "For Ben," and for every truth that arrived too late. We placed it in the soil together. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The sky above glowed gold, and the wind carried the faint smell of yeast and sugar from the bakery, the smell of my life moving forward. Later that night, I sat by the window looking down at the garden illuminated by the streetlight. The marigolds swayed gently bright against the dark. And for the first time in many years, I whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, not for the past, but for gratitude. Gratitude that I was still here, that pain hadn't hardened me, that love, even fractured, had found its way back, reshaped but alive. I wrote in my journal before bed, maybe healing isn't about returning to who we were. Maybe it's about planting something new in the ruins and letting it grow at its own pace. Outside, the wind brushed against the window pane like a sigh. Somewhere beneath, the soil roots spread quietly, unseen, unstoppable. And as I turned off the light, I knew that when morning came, the first thing I would see from my window would be the garden, my garden, and the promise it kept that life, no matter how broken, always finds a way to bloom again. It arrived on a Thursday morning, an envelope the color of old linen with my name written in a careful looping hand I didn't recognize. It was tucked between the bills and grocery flyers at the bakery's front counter. I almost threw it away, but something Maybe intuition, maybe memory made me open it. Inside was a folded letter on simple white paper. Dear Mrs. Clark, we're writing to invite you to the annual Community Memorial in Lawrence, Kansas. This year, we'll be honoring several local families and individuals who shaped our town's history, including your late husband, Thomas Turner. We would be deeply honored if you could attend and share a few words about your time here. I froze. Kansas. I hadn't seen that name written on paper in 15 years. The bakery clock ticked softly behind me. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, grounding me in the present. But my heart was already slipping backward to wheat fields under endless sky, to a small house with faded blue paint, to laughter that no longer existed anywhere but memory. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus. Every tray I pulled from the oven felt heavier than it should. By closing time, the letter lay open on the counter, smudged with flour from my hands. That night, Jason called. He'd been visiting more often lately, though we both still moved carefully around old wounds. You sound different, he said when I answered. I got a letter, I told him, from Kansas. Silence stretched between us. Are you going? He finally asked. I don't know, I said. It's been so long. Maybe that's the reason you should. I looked at the garden outside the window, glowing faintly under the streetlight. The marigolds were still bright, even in the dark. Maybe he was right. Maybe some journeys weren't about returning, but about releasing. 2 days later, I packed a small suitcase, a change of clothes, my journal, and the wooden box that held the photo, the newspaper clipping, and the letter I'd written to myself. The garden outside swayed gently as if waving goodbye. The bus ride took almost 12 hours. Outside the window, the landscape changed from city streets to open plains. The closer we got, the more memories surfaced. Jason's first day of school, Thomas fixing the fence in the summer heat, the smell of apple pie cooling by the window. I hadn't realized how much of me still belonged to that place. When the bus finally stopped in Lawrence, the air felt different, softer, filled with that familiar smell of grass and wind. The town looked both smaller and older than I remembered. Time has a way of shrinking things once we've outgrown the pain they held. The memorial was held at the community hall near the church. Rows of folding chairs, vases of wildflowers, and the sound of an old piano being tuned. As I walked in, a woman in her 50s approached me with a kind smile. Mrs. Clark? She asked. I'm Mary Ellis. My father worked with your husband at the mill. I remember you. Her warmth startled me. People here still remembered my name, or at least the name I used to have. She guided me to the front row. On a small display table was a framed photo of Thomas Younger, smiling, holding Jason as a boy. My breath caught in my throat. Next to it was a candle already burning. When it was my turn to speak, I stood before the crowd. My knees trembled slightly, but my voice was steady. Thomas Turner. I was not a man of many words, but he believed in showing love through work, through the fences he built, the bread he baked, the quiet way he cared for people. And even after he was gone, those small things stayed with us. I paused, looking out at the faces, some familiar, most not. I left this town a long time ago. I thought I had to forget to survive, but I learned that forgetting doesn't heal anything. It only hides the wound until you can't tell where it began. Coming back here feels like finally letting the air in. There was a silence after I spoke, soft, respectful. Then someone started clapping. Others joined. It wasn't loud, but it felt whole. After the ceremony, I walked to the old house where we used to live. The fence was gone, the windows boarded, but the outline of the garden was still visible beneath the weeds. I knelt down, touched the earth, and whispered, I'm sorry it took me so long. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Jason stood there. I hadn't known he was coming. I couldn't let you do this alone, he said. He helped me stand, and together we walked around the yard. The air smelled of rain and soil. For a moment, time folded in on itself, the years, the distance. The silence, all of it, became something small, almost tender. We sat on the porch steps. Jason handed me a small envelope. I found this in Dad's toolbox last week, he said. I think he wrote it for you." I opened it carefully. The paper was yellowed, the ink faint. Maggie. "If you ever read this, it means I'm gone. But don't let grief keep you from living. Promise me you'll build something beautiful even from the ashes. You always knew how to make things grow. Bread flowers, people. Don't stop now." Thomas. My eyes filled with tears, but they didn't sting. They felt warm like sunlight breaking through clouds. I looked at Jason smiling through the blur. He always knew I whispered. Jason nodded. He did. We stayed there until the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and rose. When we finally stood to leave, I looked at the old house one last time. The past didn't feel heavy anymore, just quiet. Back on the bus, as the lights of Kansas faded behind us, I took the letter from Thomas and held it close. Outside, the stars began to appear tiny, stubborn lights in the vast dark. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was running from the past. I was carrying it gently, the way you carry something fragile, yet precious. The storm came without warning. It was late August, the kind of day when the air feels too heavy, when even the sky seems to hold its breath. I was closing the bakery early. The horizon was already turning the color of bruised steel. Customers hurried home under umbrellas while I locked the front door and drew the curtains. Rain started softly, a whisper on the glass, then grew louder, harder, until it sounded like fists pounding on the windows. The wind howled through the alley, rattling the sign above the door. I lit a candle just in case the power went out and sat at the counter with a cup of chamomile tea. The thunder rolled low and distant. Then my chest tightened. A strange, sharp pain, not unbearable, but deep, like a hand squeezing my heart. I set down the cup. My breath shortened. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe stress, maybe fatigue. But when the pain didn't fade, I reached for the phone. Jason answered on the second ring. "Mom, Jason, I managed. It's my chest. It hurts." There was the sound of a chair scraping, then his voice urgent, scared. "I'm calling 911. Stay on the line." The minutes between his words and the siren felt endless. I remember the door bursting open, the paramedics' voices, calm, efficient, the oxygen mask pressed to my face. Rain drenched their uniforms as they lifted me onto the stretcher. I caught a glimpse of the garden outside, flowers flattened by the storm, their colors blurred, but still there. The ambulance lights flickered against the walls as we drove through sheets of rain. The last thing I saw before everything dimmed was Jason running beside the stretcher, soaked, shouting my name. When I woke, the world was white. The ceiling, the sheets, the faint hum of machines. Jason sat by the bed, his head in his hands. The storm had passed. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, soft and gold. He looked up when I stirred. "Mom," he said, relief flooding his voice. "You scared me." I smiled weakly. "I'm still here." He took my hand. "They said it was a mild heart attack. You'll need rest. No baking for a while." "Then who'll keep the town fed?" I teased gently. My voice was thin, but humor softened the fear. Jason's eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years, pure tenderness. "I'll take care of it," he said. "I'll run the bakery until you're better." I wanted to protest, but my chest still ached. So instead, I just nodded. "All right. But don't burn the bread." He laughed through tears. "No promises." Over the next few days, the nurses came and went, and the world outside continued traffic weather, the smell of coffee from the hospital cafe. But inside, everything slowed down. Jason was there every morning, reading the newspaper aloud, watering the flowers someone had left on my bedside table. One afternoon, as he sat by the window, he said quietly, "Mom, I got a job offer. A big one. In Seattle. I wasn't going to take it before. But now," he hesitated. "I don't know what to do." I looked at him, my son, once angry, once lost, now standing at the crossroads of his own life. "You should go," I said. He frowned. "But what about you? The bakery? The garden?" I smiled. "I've already had my storms, Jason. It's your turn to chase the sun." He shook his head. "I can't leave you." "Yes, you can," I said softly, "because I'll still be here. In every loaf you bake and every sunrise you stop to notice. That's what mothers do. We stay even when we're gone. Tears welled in his eyes. I don't want to lose you again. You won't, I said. This time, we both know how to find our way back. He squeezed my hand so tightly that it almost hurt, but I didn't let go. When I was discharged a week later, Jason pushed my wheelchair through the hospital doors into sunlight. The air smelled of rain and pavement. Across the street, the bakery stood untouched, its windows gleaming in the morning light. The garden had survived. The marigolds were standing again, stubborn and bright, their petals glistening with rain. I smiled. "See," I said, "even flowers recover." Jason chuckled. "They take after you." I stayed outside for a moment longer, breathing in the scent of wet earth. "When you go," I said, "promise me you'll plant something wherever you end up. A tree, a flower, anything. It'll remind you that life keeps growing even when we stop watching." He nodded slowly. "I promise." A week later, he left for Seattle. I watched his car disappear down the street until it was only a speck in the distance. Then I went back inside, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window overlooking the garden. The days that followed were quiet but not lonely. The bakery was slower now but steady. People came by with cards, casseroles, and stories about Thomas, about Ben, about the bread that had gotten them through hard winters. One evening I found a postcard in the mail. The handwriting was unmistakable. Mom. The city's beautiful. It rains here, too, but differently softer. I planted lavender on my balcony. It smells like home. Jason. I smiled and placed the postcard beside Thomas's letter. Outside, the sky was streaked with violet and silver, the calm after another storm. As I closed the curtains, I whispered to the empty room, "You kept your promise, Jason. Now I'll keep mine." Then I turned off the light, the scent of lavender still lingering in the air, a reminder that even after the fiercest storms, something always finds a way to bloom again. I've always believed that life leaves us notes, little reminders tucked inside the folds of ordinary days. You just have to slow down long enough to read them. It began on a quiet morning in early September. The sun filtered through the lace curtains, scattering soft patterns on the bakery floor. My hands, though slower now, still moved by habit, measuring flour, turning the dough, waiting for that familiar warmth that always rose from the oven like forgiveness. Business had slowed since my heart attack, but the quiet suited me. There was peace in hearing the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the occasional creak of the front door as a customer came in for coffee. Then one day, as I was wiping the counter, I noticed a young woman standing hesitantly at the entrance. She couldn't have been more than 22. Her backpack hung from one shoulder, her hair damp from the morning drizzle. "Are you Mrs. Clark?" she asked almost shyly. "Yes," I said, though most people just call me Maggie. She smiled nervously. "My name's Emily. I think my grandmother knew you. Her name was Mary Ellis." I recognized the name instantly. Mary, the kind woman who had greeted me at the Kansas Memorial, whose father had worked with Thomas. "She told me about your bakery," Emily said, glancing around. "She said you made the best bread in town, but also that you once lost everything and somehow found peace again. I guess I wanted to know how." Her voice cracked on that last word. I motioned for her to sit. She looked exhausted, the kind of tired that doesn't come from work, but from trying to carry too many invisible things. I poured her some tea. "What is it you've lost?" I asked gently. She hesitated. "My mom died last year. My dad moved away. And I don't really know who I am without them." Her honesty pierced something in me. I saw a reflection of my younger self, broken, searching, desperate for a reason to keep going. I didn't have a speech prepared. I never do. So I did what I always do when words fall short. I baked. We worked together in silence, kneading, shaping, folding. I showed her how to press the dough gently, how to feel for the elasticity that meant it was ready. When the loaves were in the oven, the room filled with that familiar grounding smell, warmth made tangible. After a while, Emily asked quietly, "Did you ever hate them?" The people who hurt you? I thought of Jason, of Ben, of the long road that had brought me here. I did, I admitted. But hate is a hungry thing. It doesn't stop eating until it devours you, too. She looked down. Then how did you let go by understanding that forgiveness isn't for them? It's for you. It's the moment you stop drinking poison hoping someone else will get sick. She laughed softly, wiping a tear from her cheek. That sounds like something my grandmother would have said. Maybe she learned it the same way I did, the hard way. When she left, she hugged me awkwardly at first, then tighter. "Thank you," she whispered. "I think I needed this." After she was gone, I stood alone in the quiet shop, surrounded by the smell of bread and memory. And for the first time, I realized something I had spent 15 years surviving, then 5 years forgiving, but I had never truly shared. There were pieces of my story still trapped inside notebooks, letters, and silence. Maybe it was time to release them, not for closure, but for continuity. That night, I opened my old journal, the one I had carried to Kansas, its pages filled with shaky handwriting and pressed lavender petals. I began to write. September 14th. If you're reading this, it means I finally found the courage to turn my pain into something that might help someone else. This isn't a confession. It's a map, a way out of grief, one quiet mile at a time. I wrote about the day Jason and his friends left me stranded. The hunger, the humiliation, the fear not to relive them, but to trace how they shaped me. I wrote about the bakery, the garden Ben's letter, the candle I lit every night. I wrote about forgiveness, not as an act of sainthood, but as a slow, deliberate decision, one I had to remake each morning. Some nights the words came easily. Other nights I sat for hours with the pen hovering over the page, the past pressing down like heavy snow. But I kept writing. Days turned into weeks. The stack of notebooks grew thicker. I didn't know what I'd do with them. Maybe they'd just gather dust someday, but that didn't matter. The act itself was the healing. One afternoon, Emily returned. She had a friend with her, a young man with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers. "He's studying publishing," she said. "I told him about you." He introduced himself as Noah. "Emily says you've been writing something special." "Just a story," I said modestly. "Stories change people," he replied. "Would you ever let me read it?" At first, I hesitated. My words felt private, fragile. But then I remembered what Thomas's letter had said, "Build something beautiful, even from the ashes." I handed Noah the first notebook. "Be gentle with it," I said. He smiled, always. A month later, he came back. "Mrs. Clark," he said, "I think people need to read this." "Why?" "Because it's not just about loss. It's about how to live after loss." I didn't know how to respond. The thought of strangers reading my pain felt strange, intrusive, but there was also a quiet truth to what he said. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to anyone who'd ever stood at the edge of despair and wondered if it was possible to step back. So I agreed. Noah and Emily helped me edit, type, and polish every chapter. The process took months. Sometimes I'd stop mid-sentence, remembering something too vivid, the sound of Ben's apology, Jason's voice on the phone, the first loaf of bread after my husband died, and tears would blur the ink. We called the book The Quiet Path Home. When it was finished, they printed a few early copies at a small local press. I didn't expect much. But somehow it began to travel one person, lending it to another, each marking their favorite passage in pencil. A teacher wrote to me saying she used a chapter in her grief counseling class. A widow from Oregon sent me a letter saying she'd started baking again after reading it. Each message felt like a seed taking root somewhere unseen. One morning I received a package from Seattle. Jason's handwriting on the label. Inside was a small photo of a tiny garden on his apartment balcony. Lavender rosemary marigolds. And a note, "Mom, I read your book," twice. It reminded me that you never gave up on me or on yourself. I planted these for you, for us. Love, Jason. I held that photo for a long time, smiling through tears. It felt like the circle had closed not in finality, but in grace. Winter came again, soft and slow. The bakery stayed open shorter hours, but still welcomed the regulars. People brought their copies of my book for me to sign. Some just came to talk. Others came to sit in the garden and say nothing at all. I began keeping a small basket near the counter labeled Letters to Tomorrow. Anyone could leave a note to themselves, to someone they'd lost, to someone they still hoped to forgive. Every week I burned the unread letters in the garden soil, letting the smoke rise like a promise carried to the sky. One day an elderly man came in, carrying a walking stick and a worn copy of my book. I read it twice, he said. Lost my wife last spring. Couldn't get out of bed for months. But then, I read your chapter about bread. The way you said warmth can be rebuilt. So I tried. I baked. It wasn't pretty, but it helped. He smiled shyly, tears glistening. Thank you, Mrs. Clark. After he left, I sat for a long time, staring at the oven glow. That was the moment I truly understood what Thomas had meant in his letter. Build something beautiful. Not for applause, not for recognition, just because beauty like bread was meant to be shared while still warm. The following spring, I was invited to speak at a community gathering the same hall where Thomas's memorial had been held. I was nervous at first, unsure what to say to a room full of strangers who somehow already knew pieces of me. But as I stepped up to the podium, I saw faces from every corner of my story. Emily and Noah in the front row, Jason standing in the back, the bakery regulars scattered through the crowd. I began simply, when life breaks you, it's easy to think you'll never be whole again. But I've learned that brokenness isn't the opposite of strength. It's how the light gets in. I told them about the bakery, the storms, the garden, about how forgiveness doesn't erase pain but transforms it, about how every loaf, every page, every act of kindness had been my way of talking to the world again. And when I finished, the room was silent, not out of emptiness, but reverence. As people filed out, a young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "She sounds like a grandma who turned her tears into flowers." His mother smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, exactly like that." That night, I returned to the bakery and stood by the window. Outside, the garden was blooming wild, uneven, alive. The marigolds leaned toward the moonlight as if listening. I lit one candle on the counter, opened my journal, and wrote, "Legacy isn't what we leave behind. It's what we awaken in others while we're still here." Then I closed the notebook, placed it beside the register, and looked around one last time before turning off the lights. The air smelled of bread, lavender, and rain, the scent of a life rebuilt one quiet promise at a time. The morning I decided to leave the world was unusually still. Even the birds outside the window seemed to sing softer as if they knew. It had been 7 years since the first copy of The Quiet Path Home found its way into the hands of strangers. 7 years since Jason planted the balcony garden in Seattle. 7 years since I'd stopped asking life for anything more than peace. The bakery was different now, brighter, busier. Emily had taken over most of the work. What began as an occasional visit had turned into something steady, dependable. She knew every recipe by heart, but more importantly, she knew their meanings, what each ingredient stood for, what memory each loaf carried. One morning, I watched her open the shop by herself. The bell above the door chimed. She greeted customers by name. I stood quietly in the back, unseen, smiling. She had grown into the kind of woman I wished I'd been at her age, patient, grounded kind without needing permission. When she finally noticed me, she laughed. "Mrs. Clark, you don't have to sneak around like a ghost. Maybe I like haunting my own bakery," I teased. She handed me a cup of tea, the same blend Thomas used to bring home on Sundays. "Are you sure you're not tired of watching me take over your kingdom? It was never mine to keep," I said softly, "only to tend until someone else was ready." That evening, I sat in the apartment above the bakery, the same place I'd lived since rebuilding my life. On the small desk by the window lay a stack of envelopes, letters I'd written over the years to Jason, to Ben, to the younger version of myself who once waited by the roadside, terrified and forgotten. I picked up one envelope, cream-colored and sealed with a wax stamp. Across the front, I had written in blue ink, "For Jason, when the wind smells like home." Inside was a single page. My dear son, if this letter ever finds you, it means I've finally learned what love looks like when it stops trying to fix everything. You once asked me how I forgave you. The truth is, I didn't all at once. Forgiveness wasn't a moment. It was 1,000 small choices to stay kind when I could have been cruel, to listen when silence felt safer, to believe you'd find your way back. And you did. Wherever you are, plant something. Water it. Watch it grow. That's how love survives, not by holding, but by tending. With all my heart, Mom, I sealed the envelope again, slipped it into a folder marked, "To be sent." Then I looked around the small apartment, the books on the shelf, the framed photo of the bakery's grand opening, the vase of dried lavender by the window. Everything felt complete, yet gently asking to be released. A week later, Emily and I sat in the garden behind the bakery. The air was warm and sweet, filled with bees and sunlight. The marigolds glowed like tiny suns. "I've been thinking," I said. "Oh no," she joked. "Every time you say that, something changes. This time it's not the recipe," I smiled. "It's me. I'm thinking of leaving town." Her smile faded. Leaving. For how long, I don't know. Maybe for good. She blinked clearly, trying to find the right words. "Why now? Because the garden doesn't need me to bloom anymore. You don't need me to teach you how to bake. Jason doesn't need me to forgive him. And I looked up at the sky where clouds drifted like slow ships. I think I'm finally ready to live without waiting for something to end." Emily's eyes glistened. "Where will you go? I haven't decided. Somewhere near the water, maybe. Somewhere quiet enough to hear myself breathe." She nodded slowly, then reached for my hand. "You taught me how to make bread, Mrs. Clark. But what you really taught me was how to begin again." That sentence settled into the air between us like a blessing. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The town was still asleep, the streets washed in silver light. I brewed one last pot of tea, then took my notebook and sat by the window, the same window I had written from all those years ago. I wrote my final entry, March 12th. The bakery will stay with Emily. The garden will keep growing. Jason will keep finding his way. And I'll take the quiet road once more, not to escape, but to return to myself. If life is a circle, then peace is the point where the beginning and the end finally touch. When I finished, I tore the page gently and placed it inside an envelope labeled, "To whoever finds this." Then I packed my suitcase, the same one I had carried from Kansas to this small town years ago. Inside, I placed only what mattered: the journal, the photograph of Thomas, a loaf of bread Emily had baked the night before, and a small pouch of seeds from the garden. At sunrise, Emily arrived with red eyes and a forced smile. "You're really doing this?" "I am." She handed me a small box. Inside was a silver key for the bakery, and for when you come back, because I know you will someday. I hugged her longer than I intended. "Take care of them," I whispered. "The people, the recipes, the quiet ones who come here because they've forgotten how to speak." "I will," she said. "I promise." The bus station was almost empty. I sat by the window, suitcase at my feet. Through the glass, I could see the bakery's sign 2 blocks away, faint in the distance, Clark's Bread in Bloom. As the bus started moving, I caught one last glimpse of the garden behind the shop. The flowers were swaying gently in the breeze, gold and purple against the pale morning sky. For a moment, I imagined Thomas there, standing beside Jason, both of them smiling. The bus turned the corner, and the view disappeared. But strangely, I didn't feel loss. I felt full, as if I'd finally exhaled a breath I'd been holding for decades. The road stretched long and quiet. I watched the landscape change, brick houses giving way to fields, then forests, then the faint shimmer of the ocean far ahead. By noon, we reached the coast. I stepped off at a small seaside town I'd never visited before. The air smelled of salt and lemon trees. Waves crashed softly in the distance, steady as a heartbeat. I found a modest inn facing the water. The owner, a kind woman with white hair and a tired smile, handed me the key to room 5. From the window, I could see the horizon, endless, forgiving. That night, I sat on the porch notebook on my lap and opened the small pouch of seeds. I dug a little hole in the soil near the steps and pressed them in gently. As I covered them, I whispered, "Grow wherever you can." The stars above shimmered, faintly reflected in the sea below sky, and water merging, no beginning, no end. Weeks passed, and I built a small routine morning walks along the beach, afternoons spent writing letters for people who'd written to me after reading my book. Some asked for advice, others just wanted to be heard. I never told them where I was. The return address simply said, "Somewhere with salt and lavender." Sometimes children from the nearby village would knock on my door, bringing seashells or drawings of flowers. I'd invite them in, offer cookies, and tell them about the power of planting something not just in soil but in life. One little girl, Anna, asked one day, "Are you a writer or a baker?" I laughed. "Maybe both. I bake stories now." She frowned, thinking, "Do they rise like bread?" "Yes," I said, smiling, "if you give them warmth." One morning, a letter arrived from Seattle. Jason's handwriting, older, now steadier. "Mom, I took your advice. I planted something again this time in my own backyard. Lavender. The smell fills the house every morning. Emily visited last month. She said the bakery still smells like you. If you ever want to come home, the door is always open. But if not, I understand. You taught me that sometimes love means letting someone stay exactly where they're at peace. I love you, Mom. Always. Jason." I read it 3 times before folding it neatly and placing it under the vase of fresh flowers. My chest ached, not from pain, but from tenderness. I stepped outside. The seeds I'd planted weeks ago had sprouted small green shoots reaching toward the sun. I smiled. That evening, I sat on the porch again, the sea shimmering like melted glass. I closed my eyes and let the wind brush through my hair. In the distance, children were laughing. Someone played a violin near the docks. And I thought, maybe heaven isn't a place we go. Maybe it's the moment we realize we've already arrived. The sky deepened into gold and violet. The waves whispered against the shore. I took a deep breath, tasting salt and peace. Inside, the candle flickered beside my journal, open to the last page. I picked up the pen and wrote, March 29th. I am here. I am still. The garden grows, even by the sea. My story isn't ending. It's simply folding into others, Emily's hands, Jason's heart, the quiet stranger who reads my words tomorrow. If anyone asks who I was, tell them this. I was a woman who once got left behind and kept walking anyway. And somewhere along that road, she found her way home. I placed the pen down, smiled to myself, and whispered, "Thank you, Thomas, for every sunrise I almost missed." The candle flame swayed gently as the wind slipped through the open window. Outside, the horizon glowed faintly endless and calm, a line between what was and what would be. And in that quiet moment, I understood I didn't need to reach the horizon. I had become it. We all carry storms inside us, some loud, some silent, but every storm eventually clears. Margaret's story reminds us that healing isn't about returning to who we were. It's about planting something new and trusting it will grow in its own time. Somewhere out there, an old garden is still blooming by the sea, and the scent of lavender carries her promise forward that it's never too late to begin again. If this story touched you, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Your city, your night, your quiet place. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who might need a little light tonight.